Hello, my name is Arnie Herz, and welcome to our next episode of Habits of a Whole Heart on hmTv. I am here with my dear friend, Dr. Orly Calderon, who is an associate professor of psychology at Long Island University and the director of assessment. Dr. Calderon, who I'm going to call Orly, has over 2 decades of experience in the field of psychology and working with organizations on this concept of wholeness and health within the field of psychology. And I'm very fortunate that Orly is here with us today to take some time. So Orly, thank you so much for coming here today and for being part of this
Thank you for inviting
series.
me. This is exciting.
So you've got 2 decades of experience.
Actually, a little bit more at this point, but we're not going to say exactly how much.
That's very good. So, you talk about not wanting to say how much time. I'm just going to take a quick note here. As you may know, I became a grandfather last Friday.
Mazal tov.
And,
That's amazing.
The baby boy, and it's hard to believe that I'm a grandfather. And Suzanne and I are having a hard time admitting that we're at this next phase, although we're absolutely delighted and overjoyed.
That is really fantastic.
With the birth of the boy. So, whose name will be disclosed at the bris. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, Orly, with respect from a psychological perspective, we're talking about this concept of wholeness. Could you just give us a sense of what wholeness means from a psychological perspective?
It's an easy answer. It doesn't exist. From the psychological point of view, we're really not thinking about somebody who is whole, because when we think about wholeness, it suggests that there are no nicks, there are no scratches, right? There's no damage at all. And we know that every person has their challenges, whether it is stresses that happen in their lives or emotional challenges or learning challenges. We can go on and on and on. So in psychology, we're really not talking about whole. We're talking about somebody who is well-adjusted. And somebody who is well-adjusted, we perceive that as somebody who is able to cope with the stresses in their life, who has the resiliency, who has some protective factors. Some people have more resiliency than others. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in terms of the resiliency and being able to cope, this seems like a major challenge today, given just every time we wake up and you're inundated with bad news, you got challenges, internal challenges, we've got external challenges.
Yeah.
So how do you build resilience? And someone who is fully resilient, what does that life look like?
So resilience does not mean that the bad things don't touch us, right? It doesn't mean that we're not reacting sadly when sad things happen. It doesn't mean that we're not anxious when scary things are happening around in our lives. It does mean that the resiliency, which is not built at the time that something bad happens, is something that is built over time, over one's life. The resiliency is helping the person, or the other protective factors, is helping the person to cope with those negativity manifestations in their life, so that those events or the negative emotional reactions to the event do not become debilitating, that the person does not, Freud used to say, what does it mean to be, well-adjusted? The ability to love, the ability to work, right? So when we are facing those challenges, when we are reacting those challenges, sometimes they overwhelm us, and then it really interferes with daily functioning. This is typically when we need professional help. And at other times, it makes us sad, it makes us anxious, but it's not taking over to such a point that we're not able to function.
So a key goal here is to be able to function in life without getting stuck, so to speak, in the potholes that we, and sometimes deeper than potholes that we sometimes find ourselves in our lives.
Exactly. And when we say function in life, of course, it means different things to different people. David Wexler, who is the developer of the Wexler intelligence scales that I teach at Long Island University, said that intelligence is a collection of different abilities, but ultimately that help a person to adapt and to live successfully. And that is true about other psychological factors. Really, the idea is to live successfully, not necessarily monetary success, which is what typically comes to mind when people think about success, but to live a life that's fulfilling, to live a life that's productive.
So this is a great pivot. So one of the things I often envision this in my own head, and I'm not a psychologist, is that if you imagine you're on the flat ground and there's a tree. So most people envision what they want to do is they want to climb up the tree and metaphorically to feel like they're on top of life. But many people find themselves in a big hole next to the tree. So I think we're in one of two modalities. We're in the modality of either how do we get out of the hole to get back to flat ground? And then once we're on flat ground, how do we climb up the tree to create a life of meaning and purpose? So when you're referencing this term resiliency, to me, those are the skills that allow us to not be stuck in the hole and allow us to get to flat ground. And that when you say to create a life of meaning and purpose is to climb up the tree. What do you think of that metaphor and how does that sync up from a psychological perspective?
So it's a really great metaphor because it brings up the depth and it brings up the height, right? Resiliency and coping skills are not the same thing. Resiliency is the capability to deal with negative events in life or negative emotional experiences or negative relationship, whatever that is, without allowing that to take over to the point of being debilitated. Coping skills are the strategies that we are using in order to maintain our resiliency. I'm not suggesting that people who are resilient, who have well-developed coping skills, do not go through tough times in life. I'm not suggesting that. Everybody goes through tough times in life, and the tough times are different from one person to the next. A good example, to bring it to more clinical terms for a second, a good example is the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? One of the tenets of PTSD is that somebody is exposed to trauma and then has a pathological reaction to it. But a lot of people are exposed to trauma and do not develop PTSD. That does not mean that they're not affected by the trauma. It means that the trauma has not gotten to the point that it caused a clinical problem for them. They're dealing with that. They have the resiliency and they're using coping skills to deal with the anxiety, with the fear, and so forth that the trauma has brought into their lives.
So a question for you here, just so I can understand. So what does it mean to be debilitated when you have that PTSD? Because I know PTSD is a major, major issue today, particularly in Israel with, and I'm sure many other places.
And I'm sure across the border from Israel as well,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you're asking, what does it mean to be debilitated? So again, from the clinical point of view, when somebody is not able to maintain a routine of life, right? It's interfering with their relationships. It's interfering with their ability to work. It's interfering with their ability to care for their family, for their children perhaps, or for elderly parents, whatever the filial relationship is, because they are so inundated with negative emotions, with fear, with intruding thoughts, with nightmares, to the point that they are really not able to function on a daily basis the way they would like to function.
Understood. So you're really, from a psychological perspective, helping people develop the resiliency through the coping skills.
Exactly.
In order to be able to move forward their life and function function effectively, work, relationships, so on and so forth. Doesn't mean they're not struggling with with these things, but they're successfully struggling with them where it's not holding them back.
Exactly. That's exactly the way to put it. And the work that we do, by the way, is not just with people with clinical quote-unquote disorders. About 20 to 30 years ago, 1990, mid-90s, right, there was a major paradigm shift in the way that psychology was thinking about disorders and disabilities. We're no longer thinking about the categorical either presence of symptoms or absence of symptoms. We're now thinking about the dimensional approach. And the dimensional approach would suggest that everybody at one point may experience some sort of a mental or emotional challenge. We get depressed, we get anxious, we get stressed out, whatever it may be. But that does not mean that that person necessarily has a clinical disorder. It means that they have a challenge and they can use the support to learn how to deal with the challenge better. For some people, the presence of those negative symptomatologies become more pronounced, and those people probably will need more profound help or more professional approach rather than a daily exercise of coping skills.
Got it. So I have a question. This is making me think about child rearing and parenting, and that. I think about kids learning how to ride a bike, for example. This is one example of many.
One thing that I never learned how to do, but please go ahead.
So you could have a kid who rides their bike first time, falls, scrapes their knee, and says, I'm never going to do that again. Versus a kid who falls, scrapes their knee, and picks themselves back up and keeps going. So in a sense, that the kid who's able to get back up is resilient.
Correct. Now, what helped that child to be resilient? Most likely a parent who is supportive, a sense of trust in the parents, a sense that even if they fall down, somebody is going to be there to take care of them, to raise them up, and to root for them, right? Encourage them to get back on the bike and try again. And that is true whether you ride a bike, whether the child fails a test, whether the child has a relationship, a friendship that's not going well, whether they're not successful in a particular sport that they chose to participate in. As when children know that their parents or their caregivers are there for them, they're more likely to develop that type of resiliency, and they're more open to coping skills that help them to, well, cope with those stressors. When children don't feel that they have that type of emotional, physical safety network, they become less resilient, or they don't develop as much resiliency, and therefore they're less open to coping skills.
So I read a lot, and I'm curious to get your take whether you think it's valid or not valid, that parenting over the last 20 years, or certainly the parenting of my generation and the next generation, is much more coddling, helicopter parent, bulldozer parents, making things very, very easy for kids. And that as a result, kids have become much more fragile and less capable of coping and dealing with the struggles of life. Do you think that's true from a societal level? And
so it's hard to make generalizations like that, and I'm not sure that there are data that will empirically support that this is a societal trend. No doubt that we have parents who tend to be, well, helicopter parents, right? This is what you call them, where they spend more time trying to protect their child. And possibly we see more of that because of everything that's going on in the world around us, right? So people feel more need to protect their offspring. That by itself does not mean that the child is going to become less capable, right? It also depends on how is the child responding to that type of overprotectiveness. In fact, we know exactly the opposite. Parents who are less involved with their children have more chances of raising children who are going to have a hard time self-regulating, following rules, and being productive members of their society, because the parent is less involved, the child has too much freedom, and the child is not yet able to regulate themselves. That's because their children developmentally, they're not ready for that. So I'm not saying that it's a fantastic thing to coddle your children. Children need an opportunity to learn how to fail and cope with failure. But I'm also not sure that we should send the message that parents should step back. We need to hit some sort of a balance of being there, supporting them, learning how to support them when they're failing, not catastrophizing when they're failing, and encouraging them to try again.
so it's like with everything that we learn in life is the medium road is the way to go. It's not too much parenting, not too little parenting, figuring out how to pick and choose and to really be supportive and to help your children through the challenges. And I'm assuming this applies not just for children, but for grown-ups too. I mean, we see a lot of trauma within grown-ups. A lot of people seem to be struggling when they weren't necessarily struggling at a younger age as trauma happens during adulthood.
100%. And we know that I was talking before about protective factors. So some of the protective factors for somebody who is exposed to trauma, for example, or other pathological events potentially, is their strength of their network, right? So people who enjoy a more supportive network because they have more people in their network or the relationship is more supportive, have better chances of dealing better with the trauma or the other negative experiences or even with the pathology than people who don't have such a strong social network or family network. People need support. People can do a lot for themselves, but they need the support around them, not to do for them, but to be there while they're doing for themselves, as opposed to somebody else doing for them.
So that's beautiful. And this brings to another whole point, which is the power of community. And not just the power of community, but the power of community in an era where, again, the other perception is that there's a breakdown of community where people are much more focused into their own silos within their own social media channels, and there's less human interaction, less communal building.
So I'm not a big social media expert, but I would say that we need to be careful before we condemn social media completely, because social media, it's called social media. So there is a component of communication within the social media, right? It's not completely isolating a person. Does it replace the give and take in a more personal relationship? Probably not. I would say that what we need to think about when we're thinking about social media and when we're thinking about navigating our children through social media or navigating ourselves through social media for that matter, we need to think about using social media as a vehicle, not as an end, right? Think about it this way, right? When the phones became popular, when I grew up in Israel, and until I was about 9 or 10 years old, we did not have a phone in our home because Israel, the infrastructure was not well developed and not everybody had a phone in their home. So if you wanted to talk to your friends when I was 8, 9 years old, you had to actually go out, knock on their door, go visit, or they come visit you, or we would meet in the park. Once there was a phone, there was perhaps less of this physical connection, but there were a lot of conversations, right? There were a lot of conversations on the phone. So we need to think about social media as a vehicle to communicate, not as something that contributes to isolation.
Got it. And for those of our listeners who are young, there was a time before cell phones, and what Orly is referring to is an actual physical phone that had a wire in the wall,
rotary phone,
and that you just didn't carry around a cell phone. This is back in the earlier era when we were kids.
Very true.
So with respect, so talk a little bit more about the value of, you were talking about the community and building a community and a supportive community and how that's important. And do you see a breakdown in community over the past couple decades or a lessening of it?
So to answer the first question in terms of the value, we know from the psychological point of view that community plays a huge role in supporting psychological recovery. In fact, there are psychological approaches, particularly for treatment of substance use-related disorders, that are building around communities. We're talking about therapeutic communities. We're talking about community reinforcement approach, where a person who is trying to recover from their addiction is not only receiving therapy, not even just group therapy, but encouraged and is giving tools to get involved in their community around them. And we see that, I can go on and on about that, maybe a conversation for another time. My point is that community can be a huge agent and factor in progression when we're talking about psychological recovery. But even in everyday life, being connected to the community gives somebody a sense of belongingness. And we talked about before that people will do better when they have a sense of belongingness, right? Whether their children feel that their parents are there for them. It's true also in adulthood. And I'm not talking necessarily belongingness in terms of being in a relationship with a significant other, but belongingness to the community that you live in. Feeling that there's something that you can contribute to the community and something that the community can contribute to you. And it can be in many ways, depending where one lives. It can be a community in one religious institution. Sometimes it's a community in terms of colleagues at work. Sometimes it's community in terms of the neighborhood. Community can mean a lot of things. But that sense of connectivity is very important for mental health.
Yeah, I see, with respect to my boys, very involved with fantasy football, fantasy basketball, fantasy baseball, watching professional sports. And they have a whole community that's built around that of a point of real meaningful connection.
There you go. So it's not, it's not one answer of what a community is. And different types of communities will attract different kinds of people, right? People are interested in different things. But as long as somebody feels connected to a community with shared interests, I'm talking about community with positive pro-social shared interests, right? So community with positive shared interests that allows interacting with one another, either physically or through a digital means, yeah, that's a great source of support.
Okay, so I want to come back a little bit later to the community, but you said communities that have a positive focus as opposed to communities for negative focus. And I sense that there's a whole, so I'm curious to hear more about that. And what do you refer to by that? What is positive and what's negative? Because we certainly see that, Hamas and Hezbollah and the terrorist organizations have created a community of real bonding and connection among people. We saw this with Nazism. So could you explain a little bit more of that?
Yeah,
what you mean by
I
that?
wasn't necessarily go to the more global terrorist organization. I was going to talk more about what we see, and we see that here on Long Island, unfortunately, gangs, for example.
Gangs.
Right? But I can talk about also the terror organization, but we see in gangs, for example, there is a shared community. And then there is a sense of camaraderie. There is a sense of obligation to one another. There's a sense of supporting one another. But ultimately, the actions are not pro-social, right? That particular gang is engaging in criminal behaviors. That, however, does not mean that the members of the gang are not there for each other. So we see this type of dichotomy of loyalty within the gang and yet disconnect from social rules and from social, again, positive social interaction. Do you want to talk about Hamas and other terrorist organizations?
I think this is good for now.
I'm not sure we need to go
we don't have that much more time on this episode, but I think the gang brings forth the connection, and I want to bring back to a more fundamental point, right? When you said against social, legal, social, what is, and now I'm thinking in terms of societal level again, what is something that is positive in your opinion, and what is something that is negative? What makes it negative? What makes it positive? Like, what are we looking for in a group?
In a society
in general?
So I think that let me try to start with where the breakdown is. I think that part of the issue that we have is that people are very quick to judge and to hold on, therefore, to their opinions, lacking openness and acceptance of the other. I teach several courses at Long Island University besides being the director of assessment at the PSC. And in one of the courses, my motto is something that is attributed to Carl Jung. And he said, thinking is hard, that's why most people judge. And I think that part of what's missing in our society is the tolerance for communication. We don't have to agree on ideas, but we have to be able to at least listen to the other side and at least respect the other side. And again, this is all within pro-social. I'm not saying that we need to understand Hamas's point of view or Nazis' point of view. I'm talking within more normative society, when we have political disagreements, for example.
Okay, very good. So so now you talk about political, and we see a time of great divisiveness within the United States and many places around the world where there is a real breakdown in the ability to communicate. And if you could just speak to that briefly and what you think the solution is.
So I will not presume to find a solution to the problems in the United States or wars all over the world. I would say that it seems to me that what is happening now in the United States is a result of fear. People are afraid. We're afraid for our security. We see what's going on around us. We see mass shooting every week. We see the terrorist attacks are getting closer and closer to our homes. People are afraid. And when people are afraid and they find themselves being governed by somebody they don't agree with their politics, that suggests that they're not feeling now secure, that somebody is going to take care of their fear and protect them. And that's another example of judgment, because it's coming from a visceral place. It's not coming from a rational place. Right? It's coming from our emotions. When our emotions control our minds, it produces negative mental influences, negative emotional experiences, and therefore aggressive behavior. And the aggressive behaviors can be vocal in terms of what we see, and sometimes it can be in actions.
And then that emotional, I talk a lot about this emotional-driven thinking. And in fact, I have a new blog post coming out in the Times of Israel based around this exact same notion, where people are thinking emotionally and then they rationalize their decisions. And then what happens through confirmation bias, people solidify their perspective through their data points and push out other data points. And that creates much more tribal thinking and entrenched thinking, and it breaks down the whole process. And so in a lot of our work that I've been doing on the diplomatic front, the advocacy front, and in the legal front, as a mediator and as a lawyer, is to trying to get parties to actually listen, take it in, and try to bridge that gap.
And perhaps you were saying, ignoring some data, perhaps part of the issue is, in addition to possibly ignoring data, is misinterpreting data. Right? So the work is to be able to look at something from multiple perspectives, and not just from the perspective that is dictated by my own emotional needs. it's very difficult to for people to understand the connection between how they feel and even what they do and the way that they think. And people don't always make a connection between the way that they interpret events around them and the way that it affects their emotions and vice versa. When we're able to reframe the way we think, we're able to keep an open mind to different interpretations, we're able to also bring in more positive emotions and therefore also more positive actions, more productive actions.
Orly, this is a tremendous way to end this because we've come to the end of our first episode with you. And,
Thank you.
And I'm hoping you'll join me right now for a second episode in a few minutes. And I think that's a great point to resume with, is this whole essence of what I read this book years ago called Strangers to Ourselves, and how little we understand how we actually work. And so I think we can delve into that whole topic and the next topic, and among many other topics. So thank you to Dr. Orly Calderon for joining me here on our first podcast episode with her. And thank you all for tuning in to Habits of a Whole Heart. I'm Arnie Herz, and this is featured on hmTV. Please subscribe as part of the Humanity Matters series, and we will be doing episode number 2 with Dr. Calderon in just a moment. So thank you very much and have a great day.